Okay.
Before we continue with discussion,
Thank you, Chair. You've got yourself, the Vice Chair, Councillor Corker, Councillor Coupland, Councillor Green, Councillor Gregg, Councillor Pomfret, and Councillor Potter, and myself, as upstairs, and we're just awaiting Alison Hatton.
Thank you, Jackie. Before we start, I'd like to confirm a few housekeeping. All attendees will remain muted until the time to speak. Please keep your mobile phone on silent or switched off to avoid disruption when you're speaking. And please remember that we are broadcasting live. The first item on the agenda are chair's announcements. And other than voting for the meeting, also welcome Councillor Coupland back to the field to the final lockdown.
Thank you.
No further announcements to make this time. Item 2, are there any declarations of interest to be made?
Chair.
Yes, if you find it during discussion, you do have an interest to declare, please indicate on the instant message facility by the speech by typing DOI and the screen support manager will speak. Item 3 is the minutes on the 17th of March 2020. Is everyone happy with the minutes? Can we agree with them? We accept them. Somebody second.
I'll second it, Councillor Green.
Thank you. Agreed. Item 4, Miguel. Do we know, looks like we don't know.
Yes, I just joined.
Item 4. Safety manager will give a presentation on matters related to the work plan study on night drive. During the presentation, please refer to the language and series pilot strategy, which was circulated to you as part of the agenda. Please don't forget to use instant messaging RDS if you wish to direct your question to the panel.
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? The sound quality on my laptop is quite a low quality sound. So can you hear me if I speak at that volume?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and you have your document in front of you, the series file strategy, because I can't present it online at the moment. I've also got your really speaking to that, so I apologise. The series file strategy was published earlier this year by the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. We had a look at the needs assessment, the strategic needs assessment at the January meeting, which was around the time it was actually published. We had a draft in advance. So there will be some references to that document today. Both of the documents are available on the website for the network, and we can also circulate them after the meeting. The strategy you already have, the needs assessment can follow, and there is also a double sheet document which covers the consultation on the strategy. So that's just to give you some background about the document itself. The origins of the Violence Reduction Network, which is based on the same footprint as Lancashire Constabulary. The funding for that network, or unit, as it was originally known, came from the Home Office last summer, so about 12 months ago. and it went to 18 forces nationwide, and those were the forces that were recognised as having the higher levels of serious violence. There is now a network of those violence reduction units, and they're all at different stages of development, and they're all developing slightly differently. But in Lancashire, the focus has been on early help and prevention, and that's one of the hallmarks of this particular strategy. The network is what it says, it is very inclusive and is inclusive of community safety partnerships. It also has a team, and the team has been drawn from different disciplines, and I'm actually a member of that team from a community safety partnership perspective and a local authority perspective. So I've been attending the team meetings over a period of several months now. Obviously, COVID-19 has had some impact. Some of the team members were redeployed temporarily, and generally things slowed a little bit. But the consultation on the strategy actually completed just before lockdown. So those who remained in the team finished the document, and it was published at the start of this financial year. It originally was much bigger than it is now, so the document that went to consultation had a lot more content in terms of text. So that's been streamlined as a result of the findings of the consultation to the document that has now been published. Just to give it some context, there is also reference in the strategy to the statutory duty which the government were proposing going back to late last year. However, again, because of Brexit, COVID-19 and other factors, that statutory duty hasn't been finalised, but it was proposed that it would go to community safety partnerships. And that was a statutory duty to actually take a public health approach to addressing serious violence. In Preston, serious violence was already identified from the previous partnership analysis as a key issue, and we had incorporated it as one of our priorities prior to this work commencing. So we are really in a position where we will be one of the key areas for development at locality level, and that is identified certainly in the strategic needs assessment, as we are one of the areas in Lancashire with high levels of serious violence. Others include Blackpool, Darwen and Burnley. Those are the key areas where we will need to have a cohesive policy to actually progress this with some robust and speedy approaches. The strategy is really a key document to start with, and we will have a local strategy which is part of the overarching Lancashire-wide strategy. So we're not going to vary enormously in our strategic approach. Where we will have local discretion and development opportunities will be with the delivery plan. And I'll go on to talk about those towards the end of this presentation. If you look at the early part of the document, there is an executive summary, and I'm going to, where I can, identify key pages in the document for reference. So if you have your document open, I will make reference to different pages and different figures, which are diagrammatic representations of the text as we go through. The public health approach, for those who are not familiar with it, is to take this in the same way as you would take a preventative approach to a contagious disease. I think we've all learned lots about that in recent months. Back in 2002, the World Health Organization recommended this public health approach to serious violence, and it will become more apparent as we go on how that is applied The key really is about preventing rather than reacting to serious violence. And it's looking at factors such as trauma, the influence of trauma in later life, intergenerational aspects, deprivation, and other similar factors. In relation to the strategy itself, it has 4 key priorities: prevention, enforcement, culture. And by culture, we're talking about the culture of organisations, but clearly different cultures within society are also relevant. It's about a cultural change overall in communities and organisations, by recognising that many people who are now perpetrators, although not condoning their offences, are at that position because of other factors, and those need to be taken into consideration. And that's particularly prevalent to serious violence, where very often perpetrators have themselves experienced or are experiencing serious violence. But then the evidence base of what works. So it's really important that as we develop different programs of work, we actually identify what works well and in what situations. And it's recognised generally that what works well in one set of circumstances may not work quite as well if those circumstances change. So it's about building that base of evidence that we can draw upon, and doing that on a Lancashire and national basis is really helpful. We have a definition of the World Health Organization definition for serious violence, which is on page 8. And if you look at page 8, it's at the very top. And their definition, it says 2020, but actually it's actually 2002, it's a typographical error there. Violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So it is broader than perhaps the very simple definition of serious violence. And I think that's certainly worth bearing in mind. The relevance to areas of deprivation is really clear and is coming through on the needs assessment as well. Each locality, if you look at this nationally, had the option to determine for itself which crime types and incident types would form the basis for their definition of serious violence. And the ones for Lancashire are shown below in the grid. So it's homicide, knife crime, gun crime, assault resulting in injury, rape, robbery, aggravated burglary, domestic abuse and violence, and child exploitation, be that sexual and criminal. On page 9,
just to point out the page numbers, these are the page numbers.
yeah, it's the original document.
But they are in the original. So that page 9 would be page 13, page 13.
And this page identifies the key findings from the strategic needs assessment. And I wanted to particularly reference here the Cambridge Harm Index, which is a way of identifying the level of harm associated with each crime type. So you may get high volume crimes, which have a lower impact in terms of harm, but actually make up a higher volume. And then you have higher harm crimes, which may be very small in number, but when you apply the weighting, actually makes those harm indices much more prevalent in terms of the impact of rape, for example, or murder, homicide offences. So you could have an area where you have a lot of crime, which is low-level crime, but adjoining that there may be a similar sized area where there's very little evidence of volume crime, but actually, because of certain circumstances, there are higher levels of the crimes which have the higher weighting, and therefore when you're doing an approach of an assessment, you will actually take that into consideration. So I'll refer to that in relation to how we do our local needs assessment and heat mapping in different localities in Preston. So of those 4 areas, we have risk factors for serious violence. Then they're also referred to, and you'll see that quite a lot in the document, causes of the causes, and that is a public health terminology. So it's factors such as education, employment and training, or lack of those, alcohol and substance misuse, parenting, families and communities, and child poverty and unemployment. So you can see there the factors that are applied are highly relevant to areas of deprivation. Then there are the crime types, and in each of these squares you'll see a quick summary of some of the key findings. I'm not going to read them all out, they are in the needs assessment in a lot more detail, but it just gives you an idea of what is prevalent in Lancashire. Bear in mind this is on a Lancashire basis at the moment. And then public perceptions, what do people think about their area, what worries them, what prevents them going out after certain times at night, and that type of understanding of what is actually impacting on people, actually making them a victim of those circumstances.
Chair, can I just say that the Vice Chair is asked to speak?
Okay?
Also, Councillor Atkins has joined us by phone.
Yeah, very good morning to everybody. Alison, will you be taking the question on page by page, because this is a long document, or do you want members to ask you a question after you have finished your presentation?
I'm quite happy to do whatever the members feel is easier. Obviously, as I'm flicking through, I'm turning over pages, so it is a bit easier for me to do it page by page.
I think what I'll do is I'll take one bit page after page, but at the end I'll also ask some time to answer any general questions on main points, which may not have been raised. If that's okay. Okay, then you want to...
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Do you want me to continue, or are there any more questions at this point? Any more points?
I think if you come in want to join now, then we'll do that. What's the problem at this stage? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to now go to page 11. And at the top of that page, page 6, you will see quite an interesting diagram. I will talk you through it, although it may be very obvious. And it looks at different approaches. The name is quite interesting, proportionate universalism. We use universal services that we reference to quite a lot in community safety and in other spheres of work. But it's looking at where assumptions are made and the effect on the recipients, if you like, of those assumptions. So the first one is equality, the assumption that everyone benefits from the same support. This is equal treatment. But as you can see from your diagram, a small person can't actually see over the fence because they've got the same height of elevation on the box. Then there's equity. Everyone gets the support they need. So the small person has got a larger box that can see over the fence or the barrier. That provides equity. And then finally there's justice, where all three can see the game without support, because the barriers being reduced. So then they have a netting effect so they can see through it. So it doesn't matter what height you are. Now, this is obviously been taken from another source, and that is actually referenced at the bottom. But I think it's quite an interesting concept and challenges some of the ways in which we traditionally have worked. So I just wanted to point that one out to you, because again, it has relevance to the way in which we deliver services and will continue to deliver services to take account of those factors going forward. In relation to the context of the impact on individuals, and for this I'll take you to figure 2 on page 13. And this looks like a glass target. Okay. In the centre, you'll see the overview. Going out into the next ring, you can see the 4 priorities. In the ring beyond that, there are the key elements to those priorities. So, for the prevention side, there is primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. Again, the public health process of identifying levels of risk and what level of intervention is needed. Next, alongside enforcement, is identifying criminal and civil justice. Alongside culture, it is the communities and organisational culture, which I mentioned before, and then evidence, it's evaluation of data. Then in the outer ring are the various strategic principles that are used. Now, what I'm not proposing to do is go around that circle through every single one of them, because it just takes quite some time. As I said, the document has been streamlined, and it is fairly simple to follow. But what I would suggest for these is I pick some out which I think are most relevant, not that the others are relevant. And there is one which is trauma-informed approaches, which I would like to focus on more, perhaps as another avenue, because it is a fundamentally significant part of the culture element. In relation to the principle number 1, public health approach, there are inequalities in the prevalence of violence. The greatest impact is felt by the most deprived communities, and violence is contagious. If you look on page 14, you will see a diagram, figure 7, which identifies the community, relationship and individual levels, what those risk factors include. I would say it's absolutely comprehensive, in that there probably are others that you can bring to mind, but these are the risk factors that we are going to endeavour to address. So in the outer ring, you'll see the community and wider society, gangs and local supply of illicit drugs, which is something I'll touch on later, access to and misuse of firearms, access to and misuse of alcohol. The other side is poverty, urban areas, and national law enforcement policies for education and social protection. So on the one side, you have things that are really evident on the streets in some localities, and in some homes and amongst society in general. On the other side, there are factors which may not affect all the community, but will affect significant numbers within the community. A similar principle is applied to risk factors within close relationships. For example, low level attachment between parents and children, low family income, unemployment in the family, and then on individual factors, the psychological, behavioural disorders, for example, people who feel socially isolated, those who are quite impulsive, education and employment, truancy and exclusions, unemployment, and behaviour, involvement in crime and antisocial behaviour, early involvement in drugs, alcohol and tobacco, and a positive attitude towards offending. So I think these things we are all aware of. It has been defined in a way which endeavours to put the whole picture across in an easily understood format without a great deal of text. There is quite a heavy reliance on various diagrams in here, but it does give you time to reflect on some of the factors locally when you get those problems.
Chair, the Vice Chair is asked to speak again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Alison, you know the page you just discussed, did you say page 13?
Page 14.
Page 14?
Page 18 on the top. The two lots of pages.
Yeah, that's, yeah, because that's why I was getting confused. The one you just discussed is page 18 on top and page 14 on the bottom. Is that right? Yeah? Yeah, thank you.
I have the original copy, not the one that came in the report pack. So I'm using the original document numbers, which are in the bottom left-hand side of the page.
So now we're going to draft 4.
I'm sure.
Just indicate, I have got my conversation screen up as well, but I'm looking at notes on both sides as well, so I've quite a bit to keep my attention.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Anybody else on that? Well, just one question I want to ask it. Obviously, if the situation was offending, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that they recognise that offending is wrong, they shouldn't be doing it?
No, it's the opposite. They're recognising that there are some benefits to offending. In other words, they might see that somebody has acquired a certain amount of wealth because of their offending behaviour, and they're not recognising the consequences of their actions, only the immediate benefits that they see. An example could be someone who needs to score heroin, who may go out and commit an offence to get the cash to actually score the heroin. So they see that as a positive. For a young person, it might be aspiring to having a car or something like that, and they know the way to get that is perhaps through criminality, because it looks easier.
Okay, so we can move on now.
Okay. I'm going to go now to page 17 and figure 11. And this identifies the 3 levels of prevention. At the bottom of the pyramid there is primary prevention, above that secondary, above that tertiary. So primary prevention is stopping the problem in the first place, so it doesn't happen. Again, public health methodology, think about it also in the context of preventing disease. Secondary, intervening early to stop an emerging problem. taking hold, and tertiary, helping to prevent an ongoing problem lasting into crisis and minimising harm to others. So we do work across all three, but I think generally speaking our focus has often been on secondary and even the tertiary level, as opposed to the prevention and the primary level. It's important to tackle root causes as well as the immediate symptoms of violence, and that's where that prevention pyramid comes in. So it is going in at very root causes. So you may not be dealing with people who are necessarily at that point involved in criminality, but the risk factors that may lead them to take a pathway into criminality or being a victim of a crime are there. So it's about that early intervention to actually prevent them taking that course or becoming victimised. The next area I wanted to touch on is the life course approach. I just have to find my way through this a minute. The life course approach is to look at the points at which individuals are most likely to become perpetrators or victims of crime. And if you look at page, it's 18 for me, it's paragraph 2.5, and at the bottom of that page, figure 12, you will see a number of individuals at different stages of life. The lady on the left is representing the unborn child. So actually, life course starts pre-birth and actually goes right the way through to old age. The paragraph 2.5 covers the principle 5 life course approach. And it looks at the different contexts within the lifespan that increase or decrease the chances that a person will engage in violence. For children, it's a combination of individual characteristics, genetics, social and physical, environmental experiences that lead to an increased risk of violence or development of protective factors. So it's violence and propensity to violence or becoming a victim on the one hand, and those protective factors on the other. And our aim is to build up those protective factors. I want to touch briefly on trauma-informed approach, because I mentioned it earlier. I think it's really important that we look at this in more detail. Just need to go over the pages to get there. The trauma-informed approaches are something which needs a bit of explanation. In relation to professionals, it's about how they view people in the circumstances in which they find them. So have the professionals understood the history of that individual, and are they recognising that some of their behaviour is a response to trauma? Those people who have a history of trauma find it more difficult to trust and engage with people, particularly professionals, and they often see the professionals being in a position of power. So it's about having that understanding that somebody may regard you as being more powerful than them and therefore not willing to engage with you. It promotes the strengths of individuals, their protective factors, which we mentioned a few minutes ago, and resilience. And it also recognises the importance of relationships and support mechanisms for professionals and families to prevent them themselves becoming traumatised. So it is quite a complex area of work, and it's certainly something which many of the organisations in Lancashire, starting principally with some of those in the criminal justice section of our partnership working, are actually receiving training on. You do see it in communities, and dealing with that understanding in communities can be quite challenging. Clearly, it's important that professionals have that understanding. But I think to really make a difference, it is also important that communities have that understanding. So they understand the circumstances that might have led to a person behaving in a certain way. Because if you completely stigmatise people, the chances of them actually changing their life course is really, really difficult. If it is supported and is supported within the community, I don't mean totally forgiving, but supported and understanding, then there is a much greater chance, a much greater likelihood that people will change, they will start to engage, and they will actually look at the strengths that they have in terms of their contribution to society and build upon that. And that leads into the work that's done around lived experience, where people who have been involved in forms of criminality, who have clearly left that pathway, but are able to relate to the factors that led them into it, what drove them, what were the incentives, and how they removed themselves from it, built on their own strengths and relationships to actually change their course. They can offer an awful lot to people who are in a position where they effectively are very low self-esteem, are stigmatised by society, or are unable to change their life course without that support. And that leads us into the strength-based approach, and it's about drawing upon a person's or an area's local assets. And enabling people to recognise their strength is absolutely key to changing the person's self-perception and building the protective factors, so they can build their own protective factors. But the relationships they have help with that protection, and that is the balance against the driver for criminality, and most importantly, the driver for violence. In relation to priorities, this is the next section, which starts at page 23 for me. And on that page, you will see at the top of the page the date 2020 to 2025. Now, strategy development started in 2019, as I explained earlier, but the strategy was published this year, so it's a 5-year strategy. So quite a lot longer than we normally see in the community safety world. Now, we may well, I think, have a strategy that follows the same timescale, but a delivery plan which is on a shorter time frame, but one which is reviewed and kept under review because circumstances change. So although the basic principles don't change, the circumstances may well change within the locality. So we have to bear that in mind. So you'll see under the broad heading, there are the 4 priorities, and below those, some of the pieces of work that will be developed under that strategy in the development plan. So we will have something similar. Under each of the common priorities, we will have some key pieces of work. Obviously, the delivery plan will be much more detailed. These are brief headings, but in relation to development, the locality plan will also draw on the work that's been done, either for evidence or to bring in the resources to deliver some of the work which has been commissioned and developed on a county-wide basis. And there are some case studies towards the end of the document which I'll draw your attention to when we get there. In relation to prevention, on page 25 for me, so I think you'll be back page 29, table 1. There is a lengthy table there which covers the best part of the page and the 3 headings at the top. primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. If you're looking at a black and white copy, the grey text are pieces of work that have yet to be developed, they're aspirational projects, and the ones in darker text or black are the ones that are already underway. So I mentioned that there is already work underway. It wasn't a question for the network to actually do the strategy first, they actually started pieces of work right away, because one of the key priorities for the Home Office was to get things kick-started. And in fact, annual reports were required, and the first annual report was required at the end of the fiscal year 2019-20. So they did get a number of streams of work underway. Some of those have been impacted by COVID-19. So some have had to develop into different strands of delivery. Others have progressed very well, particularly those that were able to be rolled out without the need for social distancing requirements to the same extent. But COVID-19 has definitely had an impact on that. And perhaps had we not had that, there would have been more development in some of these areas. We are putting into that in that some of the work does fall into Preston's boundary. And I would particularly like to draw attention to some of that now. So if we look at the primary prevention column, we'll see trauma-informed schools, that will apply in Preston. And gender, Operation Gender is work that we do, and have been doing for a number of years actually in Preston, but it's going to refocus a lot of its activity into schools and communities. We've worked very much in the enforcement field in the past, intelligence sharing, carrying out destruction activities, and it is around tackling serious organised crime. The Encompass programme, which is in the secondary prevention column, also takes place in schools, and it is where the school is notified of domestic abuse and domestic violence incidents that affect the family. Effectively, it's where the police have been called the night before. There has been a report of domestic abuse, they have attended, and they will enter information which goes through to the school, through the safeguarding hub, so that the school are aware when that child comes in the following morning. There may be factors that affect their behaviour, their attention span, their general demeanour, their dress, and so they're not punished for perhaps not putting the right school uniform on, or being a bit more disruptive in class than they normally are, because the school understands that that might very likely be linked to what happened at home the night before. So that is a key piece of work. It has been on the horizon for some time, but it's now being rolled out comprehensively, so that all children benefit from that information being relayed to their schools, for those who are in schools. Another one which refers to activities for adolescents is the diversion activities. And that is something which is being built upon. And there was a strand of work done from autumn last year, and some projects in Preston were successful in actually being commissioned to deliver that work, and one of them is work by a gentleman called Omar Khan, who's done some really good work over a period of time down in Broadgate, and in particular has adapted well during COVID lockdown to actually have video diaries for the children who were in his group, who have been attending group work sessions, and they then went on to continue the work online. I understand that to be very successful and will be good evidence base going forward. And then in the tertiary column, there is the Divert programme, which has been run out into custody suites. And although there was some change over the COVID period, the custody suites meets are now once again open to the divert coaches, who are live coaches, trained for this purpose of engaging with people who have been involved in serious violence when they come into custody. And following up with a support network for them, and that would be dealing with some of their support needs, referring them into activities such as employment opportunities, but being there as a life coach. And it's actually coaches from some of the key football clubs who have been trained up and engaged in this, including the coach Preston, who is from Preston North End Community and Education Trust, or Education and Community Trust. And as I say, during COVID-19, they started to work differently and engaged outside of the custody suites, but nonetheless were able in a number of the areas to actually continue that diversionary work. In relation to those priorities, I think we probably should now look at the case studies which are on page 34 of my document. So I think that will make about page 38 yourselves. There are two case studies I particularly wanted to draw your attention to in this context. One is 6.2 on page 34 for me, 38 for you, I think, which is the Lancashire case study on high crime and operations sector. This was a policing initiative funded by surge funding from the Home Office, which took place and was really evident on the streets in Preston last summer. You may remember that Section 60 cameras being applied for stop search. This was related to obtaining knives and weapons, so it was any blade instrument. Now, when we talk about knife crime, we aren't talking in this context about carrying a knife, we're talking about committing an offence with a weapon, so using your weapon to commit the offence. But nonetheless, people who carry knives are both at risk themselves and possibly may be drawn into criminality because they are carrying a weapon. So the idea of the concerted piece of work last year was to get people to surrender weapons, and there were surrenders, there were confiscations, there were education and engagement events, particularly in schools, and a number of test purchases to make sure that retailers were not selling knives to people who were not eligible because of age to purchase them. One of the key areas, though, where it was recognised that knives were coming into the communities was via internet ordering, and there is reference in this overview of Operation Siren, which was developed with Border Force and local police forces to intercept weapons which had been ordered online, and that achieved some significant results. There are other pieces of work mentioned. MAPO, which is the multi-agency public protection arrangements, and Jenga are all set up to deal with organised criminality, serious violence offending, and those pieces of work will link in and be part of not only the Lancashire-wide strategy and delivery plan for ourselves as well locally, because we have local groups and local arrangements which support that already in place. So it's drawing in that to be part of the overall delivery plan. And the second one I wanted to draw your attention to is the multi-entity data exchange, which is 6.3, which is available to yourselves actually if you are interested in, as members of the Crime Disorder Committee, if you want to register for the MAID data exchange, which is run by Lancashire County Council. It has been running for a long time and it hosts data from a whole range of agencies. It moved its format about 12 or 18 months ago and has a dashboard arrangement in place so that it's interactive and you can set parameters and define what you want to look for, and then it will search for that information for you and provide it in a dashboard style of infographic, which some examples of those can be seen at the bottom of the section. It's a really useful tool. Our analysts use it, we use it. We don't probably use it quite as much as we should be doing collectively, and tend to rely very much on the analyst drawing information out from that tool to present to us. But actually, in practice, once you get the hang of it, and a few of the simple basic rules of operating it, is very easy to use and really useful. We will always continue to use analysts because we will set parameters that are outside of MADE. And you need the analytical context as well, which you don't get simply from data searches, but it is nonetheless a really useful tool, and one that's really valuable. And when we're talking to other networks or units across the country, through the networking arrangements, it's something that others are still looking at developing. It's not something that they already have available to them, so it is a valuable asset, and certainly one we want to encourage people to use. I mentioned cultural transformation and workforce development, and I mentioned particularly how cultural transformation needs to apply to agencies. And I'm going to take you back a few pages now to what is my page 28, so probably your page 32, to section 3.3 and a roadmap. The roadmap is like a road, but it shows the different stages of trauma-informed care. And the first phase, which we are actually largely as a group of agencies still within, is the recognition and awareness. And I think that applies to communities as well as organisations in general. Phase 2 is being trauma sensitive. And it's having a foundation of knowledge and being ready to respond as an agency to people who have been traumatised. There is that understanding already embedded within the organisation. Then phase 3 is the responsiveness, and how the organisation plans to respond in dealing with people who are recognised and identified to that organisation, either via referrals or self-referrals, or because they come into contact in a daily or infrequent basis with that organisation. What is the plan to make sure that the response that is given takes account of their trauma? And then the final phase is to actually make sure that the organisation is fully trauma-informed and is monitoring how it delivers its trauma-informed practice. That is actually quite a lengthy route map. As I say, largely, I would say we're in phase 1 with some agencies such as the youth offending teams, as they are at the moment, actually in a further position, perhaps in phase 2, phase 3, and going forward into phase 4. So we've got a way to go. When you apply that to communities, we definitely still have quite a long way to go for communities as a whole. There still is a culture very often where people have been the recipients of acts of antisocial behaviour and violence that actually ostracise individuals in the community who they see as the perpetrators. Now, it is understanding the background to that person, and this is quite a difficult context to actually explain to people when they are themselves aggrieved at what has happened. but it's something that organisations will have to embrace and will need to show the way where they're dealing with communities and try to engage with communities in that trauma-informed approach. So it's avoiding stigmatism and understanding context. And if I give an example, a really simple example, which goes back a number of years actually, and we did a piece of work on the victims of child sexual exploitation, who were almost without exception, young females in their teens. And we did a comparison of a sample group. It was a relatively large sample group of 100. And what proportion of those young women had been involved in violence offences and were over to the youth offending team. And it was a significantly higher number of those young women, and certainly far higher than people of a similar age and background who had not been victimised. So there was a really clearly defined link there, and that has been identified through further studies and is quite well recognised now. And you may have heard of ACEs, and although ACEs are referred to here, the methodology is perhaps challenged a little because they are referred to as adverse childhood experiences, and they have a score attached to them. And it is identified that scoring actually isn't the best way to assess whether somebody is traumatised. And in fact, people can be traumatised later in life. But it is the childhood experience that follows through into adolescence and often into early adulthood. Sometimes new relationships change that, but other people go on, and in fact, some of their offending and their violence tendencies tend to become more prevalent when they actually enter into a stable relationship, and you do see that with domestic abuse cases. So there's a lot of understanding required, and I think it's going to be quite a lengthy journey to get not only organisations but communities in general a greater understanding of trauma-informed practice, because it does seem to conflict some of the enforcement. It doesn't have to conflict with enforcement, but it needs to be taken into consideration through criminal justice just as much as it does in victim support as well. I think now we're pretty much going through the hour, so I don't want to take much more than an hour because it is quite a lengthy presentation. But I do really want to just finally touch base with you on the work on the Preston violence strategy. We set up the focus groups in the autumn of 2019, and this was around the same time that the Lancashire Wide work was taking place. We received the strategic needs assessment, as mentioned earlier, in January. However, with the best intentions put to one side by COVID-19 and the time frame having to be put back, we've now restarted our work, but it is in a much more condensed way. We were going to hold workshops. That's just not going to be practical at the moment. So what we have done is set up a series of online conferences for officers from different organisations. They're quite well attended, to be fair, although some people are just coming back into their substantive roles. Even as we speak, there are one or two key players who are still adapting to a new norm. But nonetheless, there is good support for that. The aim is to actually present a draft strategy and a draft delivery plan to our executive group at the end of September, and then to come back to yourselves at the next meeting also a week or so later to present what the executive group have agreed. Now, bearing in mind that there's still quite a lot of work to do, and factors change, and we're looking at a lengthy period of work, we will keep the delivery plans in the new document. We're not proposing to say, right, come September, we know exactly what's happening. And some of that is because the local profiles haven't been completed yet. As that was a piece of work that was delayed by COVID-19. So we're actually doing some work with our own CSP analyst, and we're doing some hotspot mapping in our 4 priority wards, which you may remember I identified when we met in January. They were identified by needs assessment for different reasons, but all linked to violent crime. The city centre, Plungington, St Matthews and Riverton, although surprisingly Riverton to a lesser extent than the other 3. The other 3 were very dominant in the Lancashire listings. We will have a place-based approach, and if we read the strategy, you'll see place-based mentioned a number of times. What we need to make certain of, first of all, is that place-based approach is inclusive, and that we've identified where there are particular small hotspots. And so at the moment, there is some heat mapping taking place by general efforts of different parties, but principally the analyst. And we're focusing initially, when we do some work on parts of the city centre, Plungington and St Matthews. We still have to tackle Riverton, although we do have the data to call off the work we've done in Riverton before. And Plungington and city centre are probably going to be the first 2. I can't say absolutely for certain until we see the results of the heat mapping, but what we're seeing there is quite significant areas of, shall I say, red, orange, which are the higher areas for not only volume, but as I mentioned before, we do harm index assessments as well. St Matthews is quite focused on the Newhall Lane corridor, as it's now known. And I think we would have to include the opposite side of Newhall Lane, or at least an avenue of that area, as well as St Matthews. Otherwise, I don't think it would be very representative. So that brings to the conclusion that although it's quite straightforward to analyse data on a ward basis, because very often that's how it's collated, what we may well have to do is look at what that is showing us, but actually look at the heat mapping, see where it covers boundaries, where we perhaps need to do some local data searches, which are at street level where we can, or super output level, so that we get a more comprehensive picture than staying within defined ward boundaries. And I think certainly around the city centre, there's an element of that, and in particular, the needs assessment was using the old boundaries. So it was actually done between, well, it's on data between April 2016 and March 2019. So the other thing that we're doing is gathering data for 2019 and a comparison, binary comparison between the first 6 months of 2019 and the first 6 months of 2020, because there have been some readily identifiable, even without detailed analysis, readily identifiable changes as a result of lockdown, etc. So we need to make sure we capture some of that as well. We can't just work off the old data because things have changed in some of those areas. So the work streams will be delivered through the Community Partnership. That will be the delivery mechanism for Lancashire as a whole, and we will have our own locality delivery plan with a promise of help from the Violence Reduction Network, and certainly being linked to that network is really useful, because you can look at what other people are doing nationally as well, and that's helpful. We will utilise the existing groups as much as possible. I mentioned agenda. We may refocus some of that work in some of those groups, but we will utilise those existing avenues of delivery. And we will have an overview of our partnership management group we meet usually every couple of months, and then ultimately accountable to the executive group. So that really gives you a frame of how we take this forward, timescales, and how it fits with the local violence reduction network. So that concludes my presentation. I apologise that it wasn't presentation format in the normal way. It made it a little bit more complicated in that you had to look at documents, but I had done a set of notes for Jackie with all the references in, so that we can obviously recall clearly where we were looking in the document.
Thank you, Alison. Before I go to the question, just a couple of points. First of all, if you go back to the road, which is on your page, page 32, you've got the various stages. How do we know we're passing from one stage to another? Are there some kind of indicators or markers or something?
Yes, there are. In relation to this work, on the violence reduction network, and I think it's all just come on, but fairly confident it's there. There is a self-assessment tool for organisations. Now, I haven't studied it because it's a recent addition, but it will be that self-assessment tool that enables organisations to determine what level they're at. But if you use the VRN network link, which is included in, I think it's included in some of the information, yeah. That's certain circulars, yeah. You go on there are additional resources on the resource page being added, and a key focus is around trauma-informed approaches.
The overview, you did mention this ACEs.
Yeah.
Adverse childhood experiences. There is one particular well-known factor in rules, and I've discussed it with a few times.
Yeah.
You probably had adverse childhood experiences. But the trouble is, that is really one respect that's been identified. The trouble is, because you keep getting released, you keep reoffending, it's not actually preventing much, is it? I'm just wondering how we can balance the two.
I think it is difficult to balance. We're fortunate in a way. Without mentioning any names, I think this is a young person who would fall under the supervision of the youth offending team. And in that context, in that criminal justice environment, although there will be supervision, which has the punishment element, there is also the development within that service of trauma-informed approaches. The ideal is that you get early intervention in relation to offending, but in some cases that has escalated so quickly through that young person's life course, it's quite difficult to do that. There will still be punishment, there will still be punitive sanctions. It won't be a total case of, right, okay, well, this person has problems, so they won't be sanctioned. But it will be looking at that sanction in the context of their experiences. And it will be putting the positive protective factors in place for them as well. And that could be improving self-confidence, self-esteem. If that person is easily led astray because there isn't that parental supervision, it may be that after supervision by the youth offending team, peer mentoring or something like that might provide that level of support. But there's no guarantees that people will not re-enter the criminal justice system. But I think the overall aim of reducing reoffending is to keep people out of criminal justice. So the trauma-informed approach is strengthened by the reducing reoffending remit of agencies such as the youth offending team, which is a partnership arrangement, probation services, criminal justice service overall.
Thank you. I can't see anything in the vote. I'm just wondering, that's what the open for us. Because there are any. Okay, so move to item 5, which is the time of the next meeting, Tuesday, 29th of September 2020, with the same time at 10 a.m.
Chair, Councillor Boswell's just asked to speak.
Robert,
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. No, I got it in a bit too late. Yeah, well, I thought proportionate universalism is just targeting, isn't it, by any other word? But anyway, I just want to ask Alison if this report will be going to Cabinet, or will I be receiving a briefing at my office and things about it? Thanks, Jonathan.
I think that's a point for discussion really with Liz as the chair of the executive group. Normally, plans haven't been going to Cabinet. We have been agreeing them at the executive level within the partnership because it's multi-agency. However, having said that, anticipating the new public health duty, that public health duty would need to go to Cabinet, I would suggest, because it has a requirement for the local authority, which will be a legal provision.
Okay, thanks, Alison.
yeah, I think also, of course, when we finish the web study, I will report the first Cabinet and the third development centre which we write in this document, so you'll get it in that format, not the and it, talking to nobody else, we're not today to the next meeting. That's the case, can I now thank any member of the public for being following this meeting? Thank you also to the members of the stop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.